Hey everyone, welcome back. Happy Easter to you all. I hope you've managed to get a few chocolates to yourself, even though we're probably all stuck at home at the moment. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk about abstract photography today, which I'm really excited about. I don't have my producer here with me today. She's feeling a little bit crook, so let me know if there are any problems with the stream, but I'll try and keep an eye on things on my end as well. So, I'm really excited about today's topic. Abstract photography is a passion of mine, and I consider most of the work I do in my art practice to be some form of abstract photography. I'm going to show you a little bit in a second, just so you can see a bit of my background and my practice, and that might give you a couple of ideas for some inspiration too. But we're going to talk about some things of what abstract photography is. We're going to talk about how to shoot some different kinds of things. I'll give you some little buzzwords maybe to think about as well. And I'll show you a couple of shots that I shot yesterday. So I spent pretty much the entirety of yesterday fiddling around with a few different things, playing with some equipment to get some nice photos for you to talk about today, and that'll hopefully give you a bit of a kickstart to focus on taking some photographs yourself at home. So the reason why we're talking about abstract photography today is that we're going to be running a little fun competition soon at Michael's that you can join in on at home as well. There's going to be 4 things that you can sort of shoot to, one of them being abstract photography. We'll also have still life, self-portraiture, and interior shots as well. And what we'll see when I show you some of the abstract photos I've taken today, as well as some of the photos from my art practice, is that there's many areas where these 4 sort of categories intermingle with each other. So I'm not one who really likes to have definitive lines drawn between all these genres of photography, because I find the most interesting place to work is when these worlds start to merge. Before we get into some images though, let's talk a little bit about what abstract photography is. And if you go on any internet forums about photography and look for the word abstract, you'll find plenty of people arguing about what the correct definition of abstract is. I'm not really one for that sort of thing. I like to spend my time photographing instead. But I think it is good to have some sort of definition, and when I'm starting projects, the first thing I often do is go and Google the definitions for a few different words. So what does abstract mean if I look at the dictionary definition of it? And so I've done that, but rather than sort of bore you with the dictionary definitions, the thing I'm going to sort of talk about is my understanding of what abstract is, or what abstract photography is. And for me, abstraction is presenting information, in our case as photographers, visual information, in a manner that's not expected. So transforming something from its everyday normal state to something new, exciting, and different. And there are many different kinds of abstraction. You know, there's the very sort of traditional idea of abstraction where we talk about just pattern and color, and there's no sort of literal form whatsoever. And there's also the idea of taking something we understand and recreating it in a new way and abstracting that through that process. So let's have a look at some of my work that I've done. And some of you might not know my background outside of Michael's, but I'm a practicing artist, and my practice really revolves around self-portraiture or portraiture and abstract representations of that. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of my different projects that I've done over the years, all relating to abstract photography. This was my graduating project when I finished university. It's a project called Sweat, and what this is made is through a process called a chemigram. Chemigram is when you use analog photographic paper, in this case silver gelatin paper, and you mess with the chemistry of it. And what I did was I went into the darkroom, I got sweaty by doing push-ups, sit-ups, star jumps, all sorts of different things, and then I held the silver gelatin paper against my face. And what happened was my sweat reacted with the chemistry of the paper and left these abstract impressions of my face behind. And I did this a number of times, and every time you did it, you get a different sort of result. I'll just pull one of these bigger ones up for you, but really beautiful sort of poetic ways of looking at a portrait. And the final project of this was 100 photos done this way, hung in the gallery. And it talked a lot about representation of self, the physicality of self, photography as a repetitive sort of act, but I won't go too much into the nitty-gritty of the concepts behind it. Another work I've done, this one called Mirror. So this one used an Xbox Kinect and a depth sensor in order to capture the person standing in front of the work, and it would put their form through something called a random dithering algorithm, which would give this this effect like TV static or something like that. So that used one of the earliest forms of digital image compression in order to render the user as they stood in front of the artwork. And most of my practice now revolves around using webcams and computers and coding things in order to represent viewers in the gallery in a particular sort of way. The last one I wanted to show you from my practice was this body of work here called I Feel Like I Know You. So this is one where I went and found other people on Facebook who shared the same name as me, so also called Chris Bowes, and I took all the thumbnails of the pages they'd liked on Facebook and recreated portraits of them. As a giant mosaics, and this was quite I installed all these little squares. You hear all individual bits of paper, 4,000 squares of paper I installed for this project, but it was quite effective, I think, in the gallery. And it was this interesting sort of macro and micro relationship where when you stood back, you could see the person, how they looked, and then when you got closer, you could start to actually find out a little bit of information about the person from the pages that they liked. So that's a little bit of my background on the area, and you can tell, I really love this idea of portraiture and abstraction, because I find, the portrait is something which conveys a human being is a really interesting place in order to manipulate and try and display in a different way from what we're used to, rather than you just sort of stock standard, driver's license style photo. So we're going to talk about a few different things today, and I've shot some photos specifically for this class as well. But what I've done is just written out some sort of buzzwords, and I've written them out for you so that if you don't have time to write them down now, you can go back later and jot them down or pause the video at this stage. But this is another way that I sort of start projects, is I'll just write down a whole heap of words that I think sort of associate with the thing that I'm trying to create. So for abstraction, I've got pattern, color, shape, repetition, movement, lines, texture, transparency, reflection and refraction, and distortion. Okay, so many different ways that we can abstract the things that we see around us. Now, I sort of said at the start, for me, abstraction is about presenting visual information in an unexpected manner. So how do we see things in a new way? Well, we've got to start to think about things more abstractly as well, and create scenarios where we're looking at objects maybe that we find around our house in a different sort of light. So I've written a few things down as well as to how we can see things in a new way. We can look at things from different angles and at different distances, so we can get very close to something or get very far from something to abstract it, or we can also get sort of low or high and look at it from a different angle that we normally might be used to. We can look at things under different light as well. So that might mean changing the brightness of the light, changing how hard or soft the light is in order to create or remove shadows, changing the color of the light can do that as well. We can organize things differently. So we'll show you a couple of examples today where I've sort of taken random things and organized them into patterns so that we get this sort of repetition effect. We can either hide or reveal new information. So one of the interesting things about photography is that we can control where the border of the image is. So we can sort of display or show what we want to show and hide what we want to hide, and trick the eye into seeing certain things by revealing or hiding this certain information. And the last thing I've got down here is to combine things unexpectedly. So use things that you have around you, normal everyday things, in a new and unexpected way. Take them outside of their intended purpose and see if you can find some sort of new, interesting way of conveying that visual information. So let's go have a look at some of the photos that I shot yesterday. I'll talk you through the techniques that I've used to do them, and then you can go off and spend the rest of your Easter photographing and doing all sorts of crazy things with some stuff you can find around your home. I'll swap back to my computer here, and we'll just minimize this for the time being. So there are a few different techniques we're going to talk about today, but the first one we're going to talk about is light painting. And I like some of these photos I've taken too. Some I really like, some I'm not super keen on, but they'll give you the idea anyway. Some of you might have heard about light painting before. These are two examples of light painting here, so two different ways of using the effect. And when it comes to light painting, there's two ways you can approach it. One way is to shine a light source into the camera so that you're sort of burning the source of that light into the image. And another way is shining a source of light onto a subject and painting light onto it like a painter would paint light using paint using a brush or something like that on a canvas. And these two images show those two different ways. So both of these were actually shot using my phone. That's how I've created these colors here. So what I would do is I'll pick up my phone here. I had a number of different colors on the screen. Let's see if I can find one. Yeah, here's one. So what I would do is I would just sort of shine the light around in different patterns in order to create the one on the left. So what you can see there is I've pointed my phone directly at the camera and I've changed the colors while the exposure is being taken and moved the camera in different directions in order to burn the color on my phone screen into that image. Now, there are a couple of different settings or things to consider when you're doing light painting. Generally, you want to have a very long shutter speed so that you can have enough time to actually do these movements. A shutter speed of around 30 seconds was what I was using for these here. You also want to be able to control the light. So that means either shooting at nighttime or in an area where you can sort of block all the light out so it's very, very dark. That way, any light that the camera is picking up, you're adding to it. And the other thing is I shot at a relatively narrow aperture, so around f11, f16, just to give me enough depth of field so that when I did these sort of movements, I was still going to render them sharply, though you can play with focus with this sort of thing as well. So those camera settings are, an ISO of 100 too. So just keep the ISO as low as possible. That lets you get a nice long shutter speed. And those settings were used for both of these examples here. The one on the left is by pointing the light source at the camera and burning it. The one on the right is by shining the light onto a different subject. And in this case, what I've done is use my bed sheets here to create a little bit of a pattern. And through that pattern, it creates a nice sort of shadow and texture when you shine a light at a very severe angle to it. What I've done here is, I don't know if you can sort of getting the picture, but I've tried to mimic an aerial photograph of some mountains or canyons or something like that, with this nice sort of sunrise glow coming over from the right-hand side. So what I did was had a 30-second long exposure. For 20-ish of those seconds, I shone an orange light from up in the right-hand corner here. And then for about 10 seconds or so, I shone a blue light just to give a little bit of blueness to those shadows. And this is the sort of thing, like, the reason why I love light painting is that you can do this like 100 times and get a different photo every time. So you can just wave your phone or a torch or a headlamp or something around and get a different effect. You can just play with the texture on the sheets and get a different effect. Like, it's one of those things where you sort of start taking photos and then 3 hours later you're like, I'm still doing the same thing, because it's just so fun and so easy to get interesting sort of results. Let's jump to the next technique here. We'll just sort of say too, if you do have any questions, feel free to yell out in the comments section and I'll have a read through them as we're going and try to respond to you. So if I haven't covered anything in enough detail, or you're unsure as to how I've done something, make sure you yell out in the comments section. So the next technique I have here is just taking everyday objects and shining some light on them and you looking at them in a new sort of way. So before I actually get into the photos, there are a couple of bits of equipment I've used while I've shot these. One of them was a macro lens, a 90mm macro lens. One of them was an LED light. So I'll open that up here, LED video light. I use flash and LEDs just depending on, I guess, how I'm feeling for the day. But I was shooting these at night, so it was very easy for me to use an LED to control the light source, because I didn't have to contend with any other light coming throughout the window or from a lamp or some other sort of distant sources. And I used a light stand as well to hold that up, but I'll show you some behind the scenes sort of shots after I've shown you the photos. So this shot here is a photo of just some textured glasses that I had lying around. And the glasses are great. Like, I love glasses, wine glasses, drinking glasses, whatever. More different interesting shapes and patterns you can find, the better. And what I would done is just basically aligned them in a particular way, shone some light through them, and that light's created some interesting patterns on the surface of the table here. And we've also got some interesting sort of patterns and texture coming from the glasses themselves. I also really love the curves in these photos, how we've got these sort of lines and curves all marrying up. And one thing I would recommend about abstract photography is not to forget your general rules of composition. So think about how you can use leading lines, rule of thirds, color and tone, all that sort of stuff that we do with every other photograph that we take in order to create some order within the level of abstraction. If you don't have that, then your eye just sort of tends to wander wherever it wants to go. This is a behind the scenes shot for this. So these three photos I'm going to show you in a second were all shot in this way. Excuse the mess. I tend to think of my studio or my workspace like a kitchen. If you're not making a mess, then you're not being creative enough. But I've got my LED light up the top here, on top of a light stand, relatively far away. So it's a relatively hard light source in order to bring out a bit of detail in the shadows down here. And I just played around with the layout of these three glasses in order to create some different sorts of shapes. Again, using my macro lens and the same LED light. Went and found something else lying around the house, in this case some toothpicks, and just line these toothpicks up, I guess, in a way that you would not expect them to normally be shot. You get these really nice lines, you've got these nice pointed edges with the toothpicks. I've converted this to black and white as well. And one thing I've done here, rather than keep all the toothpicks exactly the same, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but the eye has a little bit of trouble knowing what it should focus on. So just by moving one of those toothpicks back, creating something that's unexpected in this sort of line of repetition, our eye has a little bit of focus going back and forth between this toothpick up here and these toothpicks down there. This was all done with a macro lens. So the lighting I used for all these photos here, Nathan, either my phone or the LED light source that I showed you. It's a ProMaster LED unit. I find it quite versatile. I use it for video stuff as well. And the camera I use is a Sony a7R II. I've used the 90mm macro lens, and also I have the 24 to 72.8G master lens, which I use for like 95% of the photography that I do. I also just took for this photo here, this is actually of the LED light unit. I thought this was kind of cool with those very I don't know if that's a word, this repetition of circles on the on and off sort of side. The only thing I don't like about this photo, I think it's a very effective and eye-catching pattern, but the eye doesn't really know where to go. I find with these sort of images, you look at them, you're sort of like, oh, that's cool, and then you sort of forget about it a little bit quicker. Whereas with these photos here, where we've got a bit of compositional sort of control and flow around the image, I find the viewer, or at least me as a viewer, has more interest. I have more time engaged with this than I would with something which is just simply a sort of pattern. So let's go on and look at some other patterns and talk about pattern and color. So these are three photos here shot with the secondary colors of photography. I'm not sure if everyone remembers their color wheel out there, but we've got primary colors are our red, greens, and blues. Secondary colors are cyan, magenta, and yellow. And what I've done here is gone to sort of complete abstraction, I'd say, where we're not really seeing the object or any intention of the object in these photos. We're really just focusing on color and form and tone. So the way I've done these, and I'll just show you the behind the scenes photo for a second here, is just by having a different colored screen on my phone shining through an empty frame with some glass laid down, and then putting some paper on top to diffuse the light and diffuse that color. And by using different layers of paper, so by layering the paper on top of each other, you're creating these interesting sort of abstract patterns. And I really love these photos. I think they're quite beautiful, the sort of thing that you could blow up really big, stick behind your couch at home, and it would just be a nice, beautiful looking image to have on the wall. Not too much conceptual merit to it, but it's all right. We can like beautiful things as well. And what I've done is just sort of intentionally created different patterns to make interesting sort of forms and shapes within the actual compositions. And that's really just moving the paper in different ways, playing around with how it lays out on the sort of the glass here, and thinking about how all these triangles lined up. I mean, I did when I looked at these, well, when I created these 3 photos, I had the intent of them being shown together. So you really, the way you're meant to sort of absorb them is in this form here. And if I printed them and put them on the wall, this is how they would be hung. But there's this really nice relationship between them. And we call this process when you're hanging more than one work together and there's a relationship between the works, diptychs or triptychs in this sense, because there's 3 photos. And it sort of means that the power of the 3 of them is greater than the power of any one photo individually. And again, you could just do this a million times and get different results every time with different colors. You could mix it up so you had 2 colors in the same photo or 3 colors in the same photo, depending on what sort of light source you were using. And there's a lot of, if you have a look online and Google, macro paper photography, there's a million different ways to shoot paper interestingly. It's kind of an incredibly versatile kind of instrument here. All right, let's go on to the next one. So this is an old photo. You might remember this one from the shutter speed class that we did, but I really like this photo just as a sort of minimalist abstract image where we've just sort of got this purple-ish gesture in the front and center of this composition. And this was shot at a slow shutter speed just by dropping a toy in front of the camera, and as the toy moved throughout taking that photo, it sort of blurs out. And I like this point I like this point, I suppose, in the fall where we've got enough blur that the toy bit gets rendered obsolete. We can't really tell what this is anymore, but we've got some really nice shape and lines and color and movement through this image. I'm a big fan of minimalist sort of photography, so I love this sort of stuff. But what I really would like to do down the stage at some point is just set this up again. So set my camera around these sort of settings, aperture of 5.6, shutter speed of 1/30th of a second, ISO of 100 with a pretty decent sort of light source, something like that LED I was using, and just drop a whole bunch of things in front of the camera and see how different objects are sort of rendered differently. Play around with the shutter speed a little bit maybe to get some different sort of patterns, but you could again just do this a million different times and get different results every time by dropping new and interesting things in front of the camera. Chris, those patterns, the light source, yes, so the light source was just my phone. All I did was just did a Google search for color magenta, color cyan, color yellow, took a screenshot of that so I had that color coming off my phone screen, and then I created the patterns with the actual bits of paper. So that's what you're seeing here is the paper laid on top of I had a diffuser underneath there as well, so I used the diffuser from my LED light source in order to soften the light and then put the paper on top of that to create the patterns. And just going back to movement, like this is a bit of a controlled studio environment, so you can set this up in a studio, but you can also just take the camera outside or around your home and move the camera while you're taking photos as well in order to blur out the things around you and create different sort of patterns. And there are a number of different ways you can move the camera. So you can move the camera, up and down to create sort of lines, or left to right. You can move the camera towards something as you're taking a photo, or zoom in as you're taking the photo. Different directions that you move the camera in will give you different kinds of blur in your photos. And think about how if you can find lines and patterns in what you're looking at, say trees for example, which go up and down. If you move the camera up and down with those trees, then you'll still render some of that pattern and line and repetition in the photo after you've taken it, even though it's going to be blurry. So some really interesting ways you can move the camera in order to abstract things that we might normally expect. All right, let's go back to the photos here, and this one here. I like the idea behind this next one, but I would like to shoot it again at some point because I think I could do this better. But what I've shot is just your typical landscape hillside. No, hang on, just kidding. I don't know if I've fooled anyone here, but this is in fact not a beautiful monochrome photo of a hillscape somewhere out in the the Dandenong Ranges or something like that. It's in fact just some piles of flour that I've shot in front of my window here, and just through a little bit of a trick with perspective and a little bit of tricks with lighting, what we can do is create these sort of shapes that are reminiscent of mountaintops. And this is sort of what I was talking about at the start, about how we can take sort of something, a pictorial illustration of something, but recreate it in a more abstract manner. So in this case, using flour. And all I did was just sift the flour in a variety of different sort of lumps so that it created this sort of mountainous terrain. I lit it from the side. This was actually just shot using window light, so the same light that's in the background here. To create some sort of dramatic lighting, so we're getting some nice highlights and shadows and getting some of these forms. I like the flower, there's the texture of it, because it looks a little bit like treetops, if you imagine this was a sort of tree-covered mountain. Particularly when you look at it really small, if I just minimize that down, the smaller it is, the sort of more convincing it is, I think, as a mountain sort of scenario. And those clouds are just the same clouds that were outside the window when I shot the photo. So I've stitched a couple of photos together in order to create this. In order to get the entire thing in focus, I had to use a technique called focus stacking, which is where you take photos, so photo there, all focused at different parts, and then blend them together using something like Photoshop down the track. And then I also cut this mountain out and pasted the sky in the background as well from a separate shot, because there was no way I was going to get both the sky and the flower inside exposed correctly. I had to do that in two separate photos. But again, I could do this a number of different times, making different shapes, and I could have a whole series of sort of landscape, in inverted commas, photos, all made from the comfort of my own home. All right, so we're getting close to the end. There's a couple more techniques I want to talk about, but if you've got any more questions, make sure you're putting them in the comments section. Hopefully this is inspiring you a little bit though, because we'll be rounding things up in the next sort of 5 or 10 minutes. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is using computer screens. Every so often I go back and create these sort of abstract photos of computer screens. I really love using a macro lens to capture a computer screen, because you get these really, really vivid red, green, and blue pixels that come up when you photograph screens very closely. And what I've done in this image here is I've just laid a bit of clear plastic on top of the screen and put a droplet of water down, and because the water's, this bulbous sort of form refracts the light from these pixels and creates some interesting shapes, and then you photograph. So really sort of eye-catching, interesting photo, that one. Again, I just took a bunch of photos with different sized droplets, changed the shape of the droplets a little bit, played around with the angle and the positioning of them. And, you can do it a million times and get interesting results. Just love how versatile abstract photography is, and how you can just sort of keep doing the same thing over and over again, but ends up with something different every time. Another way to use a computer screen is by doing an effect called cross-polarization. So this is my favorite image I took yesterday, and I've been saving the most exciting technique for last in my mind. And what cross-polarization is an effect that you get when you use two polarizing filters. I've done this cross-polarization effect in a couple of different ways. One is using two polarizers, and I'm just looking at my screen to see them. So these are two polarizing filters, and what will happen if I actually, where can I put these so we can see what's going on? There will be a point with these polarizing filters, I got to turn it that way, where I spin these around, where they start to block out the light from one another. And which direction is it? There we go, that way there. So as I rotate these polarizers around, there's a point where they pretty much go black. This is called cross-polarization. I don't know how well you can see that on your end, but we can use this to create some really interesting effects when we're shooting transparent objects. So there are a couple of different ways I've done it. The first one is using two different filters. I've also done it using a computer screen as well, because our computer screens actually have a polarizing element on the front of it, so we can use a polarizing lens on a polarizing filter on our camera pointed at a computer screen to get a similar sort of effect. All right, let's jump back here and let's have a look at what actually happens when we cross-polarize. Wow, look at these psychedelic colors. Isn't it unbelievable? So this is simply a plastic wine glass laid on top of a computer screen, shot from above with a polarizing filter over my lens. And what happens when we get this cross-polarization effect is all these sort of psychedelic colors show up in the glass here. Now, I can't remember the science behind this. I meant to have a refresher before we started today, but I got distracted setting up the photos for the stream. So I need to have a refresher. I'm not going to try and fib you as to what's actually happening with the science here, but I know it looks beautiful. And really, you can just grab any sort of transparent object, be it glass or plastic, put it down on top of your computer screen and put a polarizing lens on front of your camera. Rotate the polarizer on the camera so that you get the cross-polarization effect, and it's amazing how beautiful all these objects look. This is another photo using that actually, I'll show you. This is the behind the scenes shot here. So that's just the wine glass lying on top of an old computer screen. You are going to scratch up your computer screen a bit doing this. So use one that you don't care about, or lay something on top of it so that you don't scratch it. But that's as simple as it is, with a polarizing filter on the lens here. And that's the sort of effect you get with the shot. Kind of amazing. This is a close-up as well, so using that macro lens again. This is using a couple of plastic knives, but just beautiful patterns, beautiful colors. I'm really excited about this. I think this is all I'm going to be showing on Instagram for the next 6 months during lockdown. It's just various things cross-polarized because it's so beautiful and so eye-catching. That's just a couple of behind-the-scenes photos there of that setup. So they're the two plastic knives sort of laying across a polarizing filter, which is sitting on top of my LED light source. And that's what it looks like when you're looking through the camera on the left-hand side. So you can see that cross-polarization effect just happening to the naked eye. But really, really amazing sort of shots. So that's what we've got to talk about today, and hopefully I've been specific enough with the settings I've used and sort of given you some launch pads for you to go off and start taking some of these photos yourself. Do I also go outdoors? Yes, I do abstract photography outdoors. So at some stage I'll do a landscape photography talk, and I'll show you some abstract photos from my landscape photography sort of expeditions. But same sort of deal in the landscape, looking for texture, looking for pattern, looking for colors, and thinking about how I can sort of capture all these little details in beautiful abstract compositions. Typically I do abstract photography outdoors when the light's not very good. So if it's a pretty rubbish sunrise or sunset, I'll do some sort of detail abstract stuff instead to make up for the fact that the sunrise was no good. A couple more tips before I go, just to help inspire you, that I've got written down here. So one thing is you really want to be looking at other photographers. So we're going to be launching this competition next week. It's going to be a chance for you to take some photos yourself at home. But the best way to sort of come up with ideas is to be inspired by others. And I'm constantly looking at Instagram, constantly going to art galleries, looking at how people are creating things in new and different ways, and thinking about what their ideas are, as well as the aesthetics behind their photos, and how I can sort of bring that into my own practice. One of the best ways to learn photography is to see what someone else is doing, try and replicate it, and then think about how you can sort of take on that idea and create it in some sort of new, fresh angle. A lot of people, I think, are afraid of sort of copying other photographers when they get into it. But it's one of the best ways to learn. And what you'll learn about through that copying process is you'll learn about the technique behind it, and you'll think, okay, well, if I do this thing differently, I'm going to create a new interesting result. So it's more about the learning process when it comes to copying in inverted brackets other people's work. Doesn't mean stealing by any means, but just using them as launch pads for your own inspiration and thinking about how you can sort of take that idea into the next level. Another thing too is I would say shoot a lot of different configurations. So don't just stop at one photo. Think about the things you're doing as a project, and think about making 10 or 20 different images in a similar sort of light. Images are much more effective when you can see them as a cohesive body of work rather than just sort of one-offs. And whenever I'm making art, I always think about, okay, how can I expand upon this idea to make it bigger than sort of one individual thing? And another thing that I've written down here just as a tip is just to think about, always go back to your basics of photography, even when you're making abstract photos. So that's, the basics of lighting, the basics of composition, the basics of color. All these things are transferable across every genre. So we don't want to forget about things like composition or lighting when we're doing abstract photos. Yes, like you put a macro lens on your camera, pretty much everything looks cool once you get close enough to it. But take the first photo and then go a step beyond that and think, okay, how can I tweak this composition or tweak the lighting a little bit to make this a little bit more than what it already is? It seems like you've all been enjoying the stuff for today, so I'm glad. I hope that's inspired you. We're going to be back next Wednesday, so Wednesday the 15th, I think it is, and we're going to be kicking off with self-portraiture, which is one of the other topics for our little competition that will be starting next week. We're closed over this weekend, so don't come into the store or give us a call because there's not going to be anyone there to reach you. If you do have any questions, though, you're welcome to email me. So I'll be working on and off over the weekend. My email is school@michaels.com.au. So any questions about the equipment I've used, any questions about the photographs, just flick me an email. I'll be putting that email up again in a second on the end screen too. And I'll be looking at the emails periodically. Like, I'm not going to be working 9 to 5, but I'll be working on and off. So any questions, let me know. Thanks for joining me again today. I'll see you next week and enjoy the rest of your Easter break. All the best to you.